Now my pleasure to introduce the new COO of the Alamo, Ian Oldaker. Ian is not from Texas, but he got here as fast as he could. He's from one of them other states. This session is sponsored by the University of Texas at San Antonio Institute of Texan Cultures. Ian will be talking about Touchstone moments in American and Texas history, the Alamo, and the Twin Towers on 9/11. Ian has served as the Chief Operations Officer for the Alamo Complex Management since June 1st of this year. In this role, he oversees the daily operations, experience, and staff at the Alamo. Prior to his arrival in San Antonio, he worked at New York City as Vice President of Operations and Planning for the National September 11 Memorial and Museum. In his 10 years with the organization, Ian played an integral role in the opening of the 9/11 Memorial in 2011 and then of the Memorial Museum in 2014. He helped design several departments. In the Visitor Service Division he ran. He has a BA in History and Political Science from Loyola University in Maryland, a Master of Science in Global Affairs from NYU, and his Master of Fine Arts from Brooklyn College, CUNY. Please help me in welcoming to Texas and to our symposium, Ian Oldaker.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Mark, as well as James Harkins and David Little and the other GLO staff for putting this symposium together and inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure. I'd also like to recognize the Alamo staff who are here and have graciously welcomed me into their team in the past couple months. I now have had the privilege of working at sites of two staples of the American historical saga, the defense of the Alamo in 1836 and the 9/11 attacks in 2001. I've encountered an immediate reaction to my unique resume that might be to touch for linkages between the two events, speaking to their similarities and ideas about how one might translate to the other. But I am reticent to do that. Beyond the obvious loss of life and the courage and the sacrifice involved in both, there are over 100 years of context and history that separates the metaphysical meanings between the two events. And further, as Mark mentioned, I just moved here, and I started at the Alamo on June 1st. Before that, I spent 10 years in New York working on the 9/11 Memorial, so the scales of my knowledge are certainly tipped in one direction. Both the Texan and the New York psyches, as they relate to the Alamo and 9/11, are deep and rich with many complex layers, and I am not going to stand up here and try to speak as an authority on either. So, despite having a degree in history, I would rather describe myself now in my life as an operator and leave the historical work to someone else, better positioned to do that. So as an operator, I can tell you today about the creation of the memorial and the museum in New York City and parallel that to our situation here in San Antonio and the path that we have already embarked on to reimagine the visitor experience at the Alamo. In both locales, there is a desire to honor and remember and an ambition to build in order to aesthetically and functionally achieve those aims. This ambition to build and to memorialize, which existed and exists here now, in both cases is the fundamental similarity. Delving deeper into each case, there are similarities and distinct differences in process. And really, all we can do today is look at the process. So I want to be very clear that it is difficult to look at these processes as a comparison. I don't believe it is even worthwhile to measure one museum or one memorial against another, be it a small town railroad museum in rural Midwest, a federally created institution in our nation's capital, the public-private partnership colossus that is the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York, or even here in San Antonio, the undertaking that we have at the Alamo. Each has chosen to remember, to recognize, and to tell a story in its own way, as defined by their own specific demand, desires, resources, and sensibilities. Each location plays to a different audience, and the style of each location and their storytelling, which ultimately is the accurate measure of any museum, will be specific to the events and those locales. What was created in New York and how we did it was unique to the demand and capabilities that were available there. Likewise, we will have a very unique process here in San Antonio that will fit our own ambition to honor the sacrifices made at the Alamo in 1836. So, I am going to go through a few slides describing the memorial and museum for context for all of you. I'm assuming many of you have not been there. And then I'll draw some linkages and tangential relationships to our journey to reimagine the Alamo that we have recently begun. So, here we go, our first slide. For those of you not familiar with New York, this is Lower Manhattan. And let's take a bit of a tour. The World Trade Center sits on the western edge of the original island. The area to the west of the World Trade Center, called Battery Park City, was actually built on landfill created by the excavation for the World Trade Center in the 1960s. The full property was and is 16 acres. Wall Street sits to the southeast. If I can find this guy. Does he work? My first challenge, technical difficulties. No? Well, Wall Street is kind of... Beautiful. So Wall Street is right around in there. The World Trade Center, obviously there. Battery Park City, which was the area created with a lot of the landfill from the excavation, is right here. The original site had 7 buildings, the most famous of which, of course, were the Twin Towers, and the rebuilt site also has 7 buildings. The World Trade Center land is owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which is a quasi-governmental organization charged with overseeing commercial entryways into the New York and New Jersey shared harbor and airspaces. The organization is overseen by the 2 governors of each state and has a governing board as well as their own police force and their own flag. As soon as you step off the curb of a World Trade Center sidewalk onto Church Street to the east or onto West Street to the west, you are officially on New York City property. And this multi-jurisdictional crossover in the heart of a single zip code had the potential to be a major roadblock in rebuilding the site. But I am pleased and proud to have witnessed the leadership in place to make sure there was cooperation and progress. There were plenty of bumps in the road, but all parties literally were in the same room often, working towards the common goal of rebuilding. There we go. So, at the World Trade Center, focusing in on the detail of the 16 acres, there's a shared infrastructure underneath the entire site. And depending on how you count, there were about a dozen different projects planned and undertaken under the umbrella of rebuilding the World Trade Center. The projects were linked by a shared original master design created by Daniel Libeskind. The 8 acres that are dedicated to the memorial and the museum sit at the center of the entire design. Libeskind envisioned a series of towers, giants, surrounding the memorial site, cascading in height and sloping downwards towards the southern horizon and enveloping, almost protecting the memorial. The tallest of those towers, Tower 1, right there, was colloquially referred to as the Freedom Tower originally, but the port has since made an effort to move away from that moniker. Tower 1 stands 1,776 feet and stretches even higher with the mast on top to become the tallest building in North America. It was designed by David Childs and opened in November 2014. It houses 94 floors, including office space for its anchor tenant, Condé Nast, and the One World Observatory. Tower 2 is planned for right there, to the east. It was originally designed by Lord Norman Foster and has since been redesigned by the Bjarke Ingels Group out of Denmark, is slated to rise to 1,340 feet. Tower 3 is right there, to the south. Just recently topped out. This is a picture probably from 18 months ago. It just recently topped out at 1,079 feet and should open within the next few years. It was designed by Richard Rogers. Tower 4, right there, next to the south, opened in November 2013. It stands at 977 feet and is designed by Fumihiko Maki. Tower 5 is planned for the southern edge of the site And that area is now under consideration to be repurposed by the port. The shared infrastructure includes an entryway right here called the VSC, the Vehicle Security Center, an underground parking garage and screening facility for all deliveries and drop-offs to any building on the 16 acres. The roof of that facility will have a public park and a new St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox church, which replaces the one on the original site. And that church is designed by Santiago Calatrava. Speaking of him, he also designs the transportation hub right there that sits in between towers 2 and 3. Calatrava's design symbolizes a phoenix rising, and the station on Port Authority's PATH train system connects Manhattan and northern New Jersey. To the northern edge of the site, right there, is Tower 7, which was the first building rebuilt, opening in May 2006. It's only 743 feet tall. The final World Trade Center building is a planned performing arts center, slated for right there, located at the base of Tower 1. Last week, actually, a final design was published by Frank Gehry, showing a cubist exterior and a number of interior stage spaces ranging from 150 to 800 seats. It's a spectacular design. I encourage everyone to check it out at rex-ny.com. Focusing on the memorial itself, the memorial in total included 8 acres. The dominant elements, of course, are the 2 pools, the waterfall pools symbolizing the absence of the 2 twin towers. The north and the south pool sit inside the original footprints of those 2 buildings, and in between them is the entryway to the museum's pavilion that leads to the museum underground for 7 stories. The design is titled Reflecting Absence and was created by Michael Arad. It was a design chosen from over 3,700 applicants to a public design competition overseen by a panel under the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation. And this is probably, and looking at this picture, this is probably our first connective moment to the Alamo project. What we have here is the ambition to memorialize a tremendous tragedy in downtown New York City. The design aimed to separate the space from the bustle, the traffic, the noise, and the commotion of the surrounding urban area. And ultimately, the design does that quite spectacularly. On the site, you hear the roar of running water. You hear people talking, but it allows you to be quite introspective. You don't hear the car horns. You don't hear the commotion that invades almost every other corner of the city. The designers described it as creating an urban oasis, and it does feel like that when you're there. You're transported to another spot. And the city of San Antonio has grown over the Alamo grounds over time and physically taken over sections of it. The Alamo is crowded by the urban elements, and part of the discussion with the master plan is how to reestablish some separation. In both cases, is the desire to separate the experience from the surrounding area while at the same time blending the design into the urban landscape. This is absolutely much trickier said than done, but we have evidence that it is possible looking at this design here. Moving on, there are over 400 trees on the Memorial Plaza, all of them swamp white oak trees, except for one. And you can see it right there at the bottom in the middle. That particular tree is called the survivor tree. It is the only tree from the original World Trade Center to have survived the catastrophic attacks. When found by recovery workers, it was badly burned, only about 5 feet tall, and it was taken to the Bronx and nursed back to health, and eventually grew into what you see there. It was the first tree planted back on the site in 2010. It's a Callery pear tree, and you can see it in full bloom in the spring. Despite the power of the plaza's design, it's actually quite a simple plan. The signature design elements around each pool are the bronze parapet panels where the names of the 2,983 victims that died in the 3 different locations on September 11, 2001 are inscribed. And you can see they are backlit right here in the picture to the top right. Here are the parapets in daylight and at night. In addition to the victims of 9/11, the names of the 6 victims from the February 26, 1993 attack on the World Trade Center are also inscribed on the north footprint. When the Memorial Plaza opened in 2011, it was the first of all those World Trade Center projects that I mentioned before to debut. So it was surrounded by heavy construction on all 4 sides. The orange areas you see here, this is the entire World Trade Center site. All of this was under construction, and we opened the memorial in the middle of all of it. The design idea of the memorial was to have open access and unencumbered entry from all four sides. However, the push to get the memorial open in time for the 10th anniversary outpaced the completion of substantial access ways through the surrounding construction areas. So we had to funnel people from the south through a waiting area here. Each day, you can see the arrows leading up to the plaza and then coming out of the plaza. The World Trade Center, and they're exiting back out through a protected pathway that we created along West Street. Given the site's enclosure, we were treated much more like a building than an open place of assembly in those first few years. So we had to ticket the access to the plaza in order to limit the instantaneous capacity in case of emergency. Originally, this was a time ticketing process for free tickets. It was our first measure of the true demand to see the site, and we were blown away. You can see the stats here of how many people we were processing on each day. We topped 20,000 per day quite regularly, and in addition, since the site was enclosed, we had to run all staff and all visitors through an airport-style security screening process. During this pre-museum phase, again, I can draw a parallel to what might happen here in San Antonio in the future. We are already operating a free open access site, and we will likely have to go into several phases of construction, whatever the master plan decides for us. So my point is, it's completely possible to have your cake and eat it too. We can still do both and operate an open access site with construction surrounding it. In total, looking at the figures related to the construction of the memorial and then the museum, you can see the figures here. The cost, $700 million, and this is my segue into talking about the organization behind the numbers. The 9/11 Memorial and Museum is the short version for the National September 11th Memorial and Museum at the World Trade Center Foundation, Incorporated. It was decided before a shovel even went into the ground that the Port Authority would relinquish control of half of the World Trade Center site to a 501c3 not-for-profit, which became the 9/11 Memorial, and would be charged with designing, building, and operating the memorial and museum independent of the Port Authority or any other stakeholder. The 9/11 Memorial was run by an enormous board of directors. At any given time, there were 50 to 60 different board members from all walks of life. Business leaders, family members, politicians, philanthropists, more. The CEO was Joe Daniels, who was one of the finest leaders I ever had the pleasure of working with and encountered, and he balanced what was a multi-year, daily, 3-year circus to open the memorial and museum quicker than anyone could have imagined. The board was chaired by Michael Bloomberg, who assumed the chairman's seat a few months after being elected mayor of New York City. He is still the chairman now, several years past the end of his mayoral term. So when I started there in 2006, I was the 31st employee. And when I left in this past May, that organization had grown to over 630 people. So there's substantial growth just in the organization to match the size of the project as it got closer to completion. Over the years, we of course had to work in close contact with a number of different entities and stakeholders. And the two primary ones were the city of New York and the Port Authority. And this is where our expertise as a 501c3 organization really grew and excelled. We had to balance those strategic interests towards one single goal, opening those buildings. And the port owned the land, and they were actually building the memorial and museum for us. And the city was obviously run by our chairman. So we sat in between that relationship, but we had plenty of influence to get the job done, ultimately, for sure. In addition, we had to work with other external stakeholders, and I'll just name a few of the most prominent ones: NYPD, FDNY, PAPD, federal agencies, other first responder agencies, family members, local community members, survivor networks, and other 501c3 partner organizations related to the 9/11 mission, and many, many, many others. This level of commotion was fun, but it was certainly interesting. It was also a challenge to build by democracy and consensus. The levels of approval to get some simple projects completed often took several rounds of input from many on the list that I just mentioned. There were rarely decisions made on the whim of the chairman or the CEO alone. I mentioned that many of the lead groups were often put in the same room to figure out paths forward, and this actually happened quite regularly. And these were how it was truly built. A huge amount of cooperation, overcoming personal interests, personalities, and ultimately staying focused on the main goal. There is certainly an obvious parallel here to our Alamo process. We have multiple agencies involved, multiple organizations involved, and multiple interests involved with the running of the site and its future. My point is, it can work. It's not a bad thing. It's complicated, and it ages you quickly if you're in the trenches. But ultimately, if all parties focus on the main goal, it can work, and work quite impressively, as you can see. One of the differences that each of those stakeholders brought to the table, and a major challenge to overcome, was just the simple intention of who the memorial was for. And our CEO was insistent that we should be open every single day of the year and for many, many hours each day, just as if the fences were down and people could walk on and off without hesitation. And as we grew, he pushed the notion of how long we could be open each day, and ultimately I learned from him why he pushed so hard on this. Really, it was about providing the opportunity to experience this huge memorial on your own, in your own time and in your own way. And I realized that for the first time a few days before we opened in 2011. I had taken over the training of the frontline staff that would debut on what we called Day 2, which was September 12th, the day we opened to the public. Day 1 was September 11th. And that was an event just for family members. The training occurred on site, and in the midst of all of that construction, one of my staff pulled me aside and pointed me towards a woman who was at the entrance and said she'd like to speak to you. Now, it's important to notice that we didn't allow anyone onto the plaza before it opened. Our intention was that the plaza would first be seen and touched by family members. We never saw it. We didn't know what was up there. You had to go through a tunnel, and it was on a bit of a raised piece of land. So I went over to this woman, and she was very thin and demure, and I just introduced myself, and she said that she had lost her husband, and she didn't want to come on the opening day. And it was the first time I had ever heard someone didn't want to come on the opening day. This was a huge event. It didn't make sense to me. But she said she didn't want to be there, and she was wondering if she could get in and get to see his name now. I said, my first reaction, being a stickler for rules in my head, was of course no. But I looked at her and thought, wait a minute, what am I doing here? Of course, absolutely. We walked together up to the plaza, and all of us at that point on staff had books of where each name was. They were numbered by panels in the different bronze parapets. So I was able to tell her which panel number to go towards. And she very politely, I offered my assistance if she needed any help going there. She very politely looked at me and just put up her hand like this and stopped me dead in my tracks. And she went off. I went back to training, and about a half hour passed, and I remember I had just let somebody onto the plaza, and I probably shouldn't have done that. I should go find out where she is. She was coming down the exit path, and I encountered her, and in my mind, I was about to babble and say a lot of nonsense to her about the dignity of being there and 9/11 and the greater meaning, and she just looked at me and just said, thank you. I looked at her and the grace that she carried with herself, and I just said, did you find what you were looking for? And she put her hand on my wrist and just said, thank you, again. And she walked away. I never knew her name. I have no idea who she was. I'll never forget her face. But it was the first time that I really encountered what was a recurring theme, and that was that we built an enormous place, an almost monstrous, colossal, huge thing. But the experience was best when it was very private, when it was one-on-one. It was meant for people just to experience in a very intimate nature, and that's how people recalled 9/11. And to close, the memorial continues to be open every single day of the year for many, many hours each day, and probably will be for all time, including holidays. So the years that passed between opening the memorial in 2011 and opening the museum in 2014 We're filled with learning for our staff, really, and this is very similar to the state we're in right now with the Alamo Complex Management staff. We have time on our hands to experiment and become expert operators, and that's really what we did ahead of opening the museum. We used to compare ourselves to Disney because of the size of the site. We really couldn't find another museum to think about on our scale. The Metropolitan Museum in New York was sort of the gold standard bearer of collections and artifact presentation, but we didn't have that yet. So we kept looking at Disney, and we would bring Disney consultants up to the site, and they would look at it, and our challenge was moving people around into the site and out of the site, and we would ask if they had advice, and Disney would simply say, we have no idea what to do with this. You guys are the experts. You teach us. So my staff would would be very funny about giving me a few jokes about their future autobiographies, and they entitled them, If These Stanchions Could Talk. We had stanchions all over the place. We got very good at moving people through our time ticketing system, and that prepared us for the opening of the museum, which was on May 15th, 2014. We learned about that date in the preceding fall, right after the 12th anniversary. And it was very much a mad rush to get to the finish line. I will say the opening was amazing. We opened for 1 week, 24 hours a day, every day, just so family members, stakeholders, first responders could come at their leisure. And we knew it was huge, and the stories were impossibly daring and overwhelming, and we could never really train inside the space because the construction literally went up through the last minute. But once people were inside, you saw the depth of the storytelling, and it was absolutely overwhelming. And you can see here the stats related to demand. The fences that surround the plaza came down the day the museum opened, and thus anyone could walk onto the memorial freely like an open park. And then we adapted our time ticketing system for the museum, and it finally fell into a paid ticketing system. And we relied on our expertise to move rather large crowds into an interior space. Because the museum is below grade, it has actually a very small capacity due to emergency considerations. So you can see from this slide some of the following pictures, the largesse and the scope of the spaces within the below grade museum. This area is called Foundation Hall. These areas communicated the enormity of the devastation. They also had an effect of creating a very peaceful and ponderous area, similar to the separation on the plaza from the surrounding city. Foundation Hall, you can see the central focus in Foundation Hall is right here, and it's called the last column. It's a piece of box beam steel that was simply started acquiring remembrance graffiti as the recovery work on the pile went on during the recovery period between September 12th, 2001 and May 28th, 2002. The last column was severed from the foundation and rolled out on May 28th, 2002, and because of its size, it was lowered into the museum area very early, and most of the museum was built around it. In an opposite sort of look, this space, very simple, very small in its design, is just as powerful. It's just pictures. The room is called In Memoriam, and it is set underneath the south footprint and contains a picture and biography of all 2,983 victims. The biographies were collected with public input. Family members, friends, colleagues could all record remembrances or provide digital copies of anything to recall their loved ones. And these stories were compiled into short pieces that were played in an inner theater inside that room. Knowing the content and how it is presented, very obvious, very powerful, you would think that the space would be full of emotion and tears and people crying, and it really was never like that. It was a very active space, surprisingly. It was you could watch people understand and educate themselves about these victims. And oddly enough, more people crowded in here, the more people that crowded in here, it was harder for people to focus. And I think that speaks to, again, the theme of creating enough space for somebody to have a very intimate moment with the history. It was an example of something we saw on the plaza as well, and within the museum, and it became a little shocking to us, just the decorum that a lot of visitors brought to the site. And this started even before the museum opened, and we received complaints from many different people about other tourists on the site and how we should limit it or educate tourists more before they get on the site. And that's a very difficult thing to do once you start dictating how someone should memorialize and how someone should behave in a public environment. You go down a very strange path. So we never really went as far as to police people, but we did have to put up a lot of signs about what we expected for decorum, that it was a place of remembrance, reflection. The idea of an open park, people were very happy to get away from the rest of the tourist activities in New York and just express themselves, run, jump, do things that you would normally do in a park, but our park was different. And that was very difficult to educate people on. The Alamo, so far, I have noticed, encounters similar problems, issues with decorum. And this will not be something that we can solve with the master plan. It won't be something we can solve in the next couple of years. It's going to take time, and we're going to have to experiment with different ways to influence and educate our visitors. And it's something that we as operators will have to handle once the new site is there. Throughout the museum, there are pieces of considerable size and scale, like those that you see here, the steel beams from the North Tower right here, it's called the Tridents. The quote that you see right here became very iconic. "No day shall erase you from the memory of time," from Virgil. It is the first thing you see as you descend to bedrock before you enter into the in memoriam chamber that I showed earlier. And then you see the bent steel here. Well, in the lower right-hand corner, right there. This is actually impact steel from the North Tower. Imagine the front nose of a plane crashing right into there. Everything we had a very authentic and powerful story, and it was tied to a larger narrative of recollection and recognition and sacrifice and heroism. What I admired about the space, like Foundation Hall and many of the areas in the museum, was the blending of architecture and those cavernous designs with moments of intimacy. And it would be easy to get overpowered by the space and the size of these objects. But they each had their own strategic stories related to our narrative. But the content never preached. It didn't holler patriotism, or it didn't try to beat you down with any sort of specific message. It presented facts and allowed visitors to draw their own conclusions. Here as well, the scope of pieces like this particular fire truck, which was called Ladder 3, and the intimate pieces like these two. This is the computer taken from Ramzi Youssef, the planner of the 1993 attack that they found with his belongings in Manila. And this is Todd Beamer's watch, who was sort of iconically remembered for saying, "Let's roll," before passengers tried to retake Flight 93. And that's Todd Beamer's business card. The museum stories from all sites and all locations and all victims, and we debated the extent of telling the Iraq War story and the bin Laden assassination story and how far the 9/11 story should go. But our CEO is insistent that we tell as much of the impact and legacy of 9/11 as far as it could go. And there were several exhibits that were made to keep the story of 9/11 and people's impressions of how it still affected them alive. A lot of that had to do with oral histories and getting people to open up and talk in recording booths at Bedrock. So the museum designers included a lot about the legacy of 9/11 and the enduring impacts of the events. The collection content itself, I believe, is probably a major deviation between the memorial and the Alamo. We knew where all the artifacts were. There was a giant airplane hangar at JFK Airport called Hangar 17. I got to see it for the first time in 2009, and you walk in and you see PATH train subway cars and just pieces of steel everywhere. They're huge, and they were preserved because they were evidence originally. And the Port Authority had a team of preservationists and curators take very, very good care of all that steel, even though it was burned, charred, rusted, tangled, and destroyed. So we knew where everything was. The Alamo, we have a different challenge. Our collections are spread far and wide. Many are held by private collectors, and we have to assert the authenticity of some things. So that is something that we will have to work on in the future. It's a different environment, and we'll have to bring in a good staff to help us do that. I believe one of the main things in New York, and I spoke to it earlier, was keeping the conversation alive about 9/11. And we had to work at this and keeping the story relevant and current. And in part, our VIPs actually helped us. We had popes, we had princes, we had presidents, prime ministers, politicians, and pop stars of any ilk, athletes, actors, singers, many others. And as superficial as it sounds, they were actually incredibly powerful. Some of the best visits you could have with somebody was a person you would assume would act in one way because you had seen them portrayed in the media in a certain light, and then you got them around our artifacts and our history and even on the plaza and the names, and they became extremely human. And that was very powerful. And then they kept that conversation going by all the influence they had around the world. We often traded stories in the office about the VIP tours that we had done. Our CEO was incredibly affected by meeting Tony Blair. Others, we got to run into chiefs of police and deputy cabinet ministers. I think I took it for granted until I wasn't a part of it. I got to take David Ortiz around on Christmas Day a couple of years ago, and I spent 2.5 hours with him. And this is somebody I only knew from watching him run around bases and being a Twins fan when I was very little. But here he was, and we shared an experience I'll never forget. And I said before, I left learning that this was huge in scope and meaning, but it was a very personal journey for each person on site. And it was told so beautifully from the moment you walked across the street to the moment you realized how overwhelming it was at Bedrock. In conclusion, about the Memorial and Museum in New York, I think what I realize now and that I'm most proud about is being associated with how the immense history and the story was told. And that is really what I look forward to on working with the Alamo, how we're going to tell the story, how to tell it in a way that is accessible and meaningful to each and every person. A story that has stuck with me as I left in May happened in April. One of my staff, his name is Jerry Diamadeo, and he was a very, very young kid. And his father had died, was working in Cantor Fitzgerald and had died on 9/11. I was always very hesitant to hire family members because we tried it the first few times in our early years, and they did not like it at all. You encountered questions about bathrooms all day long. And to them, they wanted to talk more about their experiences and find a little bit of closure. So I always gave family members who were interviewing a bit of a cautionary tale and told them they will not like this. And they had to be honest with me about when they reached their limit. And that was okay, that if they reached their limit, it was time to go. Jerry probably never knew his dad very much at all. He's that young. And he assured me he would be fine. And I said, okay. So he was a visitor services host, and we put him out on the field, and he excelled at it. He enjoyed the work immensely. And I had another interview a few months after Jerry started with a young man named Andy who had lost his mother. And Andy didn't have the same sort of panache and sort of confidence that Jerry had, so I was a little bit more worried about him. And I saw Jerry kind of near where we were where I was interviewing Andy. And I thought, why not? Let's have them talk. Maybe Jerry will talk some sense into him. And I brought Andy over and explained Andy, Jerry, Andy. And I said to Jerry, Andy's thinking about working here. And Jerry cut me off, and he just looked at Andy, and he said, "This is the greatest thing I've ever done because I get to be with my dad every single day." And the interview was over. Andy and Jerry are both still there, and they're both doing fine. But it reminded me how personal it is for each individual. And Jerry worked in a huge environment. He worked outside on all 8 acres. He worked in 7 stories, but he had this connection every single day that he was there. And that's really what it was about. So I don't think the slide before showing you popes and princes and pop stars, I don't think the price tag is associated with them. It's much more about somebody like Jerry. And in that respect, I would say it was worth it, even a bargain. So in closing, looking at the numbers, you can see the size and scope of the budget, the staff and the experience that defined each day. And again, I would think about Jerry and just say all of this, all the effort that goes into all this, it was worth it. It absolutely was worth it. The story that was told is immense, but it creates an amazing amount of emotion on site, and it creates an experience that's unlike any other. So moving on to the Alamo. I think there are, as I mentioned before, a lot of tangential relationships in terms of our process. We already have leadership in place that comes from a number of different areas. We have public engagement in place that we went through extensively in New York, and this symposium today is one of those efforts. And then there's the experience. There's relationships in urban space, how the site is accessed. Decorum is also a tangential relationship. And the collections and artifacts is going to be a very unique process to the Alamo, and I'll be very excited to get involved with that. And finally, the storytelling. And I told you before I was honored in how we told the story in New York City, and I'll be honored by the time we're done with this one. So thank you very much.
We do have time for some questions, if anybody has questions for Ian. Wait for the microphone, please.
First of all, thank you for coming to Texas.
Pleasure to be here.
You're going to do
Thank you for
great
having
here.
me.
I'm just kind of curious. I know you're kind of early on into this, but where do you see the Alamo going? How is it going to change?
I see Lewis back there, and I almost want to deflect to him. I don't know yet. We're too early to say that. And my role is to build a staff and build an experience that will receive whatever this master plan is and be ready to present it in the best light possible. And that's as far as I can think right now. In terms of what we do on site, I think of this moment as we can try a lot of different things and see if they work. And what those things are, different types of talks, different types of experiences with visitors. I think we have a nice moment to really experiment. But you know, I'm going to be receiving a big gift, and it's my job to prepare to receive that.
So is there a master plan currently? And if not, when do you expect one?
I think that's the next panel. Is that the next panel? It's a panel later today, the last panel. I do not know. I think save that question for an hour or so.
My question is when you develop the master plan, will consideration be given to finding and returning the remains to the Alamo complex?
I really can't speak to that. I don't know, and I would save that question again for the master plan team that'll be up here in a little bit. Yes.
I wanted to know, have there been any initial considerations given to the potential legal conflicts with some of the surrounding businesses, existing buildings, and so forth?
Yeah. Again, I'm sorry to have given you guys a presentation that hints about master plan, but my involvement, as I said right now, is really to work on what we have already on site. I think these are great questions, and I think you're giving the master plan team a head start on answering them in a couple hours.
Did you have a gift shop or retail component with the 9/11 museum? And if you did, how did you balance that with the memorial side and being honoring the families that were visiting?
Absolutely. It's a good question. I actually didn't put up there because I thought someone might ask it. Yes, we did. We actually had it before the memorial even opened. What we saw, really the inspiration for it was our CEO saw walking on his way to work all their street vendors selling 9/11 items. You can get these little books that show pictures of carnage and things. And who knows where that money was going? So his idea was, well, if there's people making money off of the 9/11 story, it should come to our operation, and we support the family members support us and this museum, it should come back into this organization. So initially we developed a satellite retail space to kind of the near City Hall and Brooklyn Bridge in an old camera shop, and we called it the Preview Center. And it was half retail and half exhibition space. And we were very worried about the reaction, and we were pleasantly shocked. It did amazingly. We got nothing but good reactions, and all the family members on our board and that weren't on our board who worked with us were just happy to see people engaged in the story. So it was not so much about the idea of making money, it was about how we went about telling the story and using the revenue to then further the story. there is a fairly sizable, probably about half the space, gift shop inside the museum. And then in the last couple of years, we put retail carts onto the plaza itself. Again, we kind of experimented just to see if it would be appropriate, and it worked. A lot of these were, like I said, were done in reaction to commercial activity that was happening around outside the plaza in the area, but it made more sense to us to have that commercial activity funnel through the organization.
What nexus or interaction will you have with the on-site experience with as coordination with the other missions and what they're doing with the National Park Service and whatever? How will that work together?
So far, we haven't had much, but it's definitely an area that I want to explore. And I think, obviously, the Alamo story is part of the other mission story, and we need to see how we can provide some synergy between all of those stories. I think it's a great question and something I definitely want to investigate right away.
Got one right here, and then you.
Last one, please.
Yeah, could you tell us about your experience the first time you saw the Alamo in person?
Sure. It was the day before, no, it was a week before my first interview. I came down on my own because I kind of wanted to be prepared for the interview and not, I had interviewed so many people at the memorial who didn't go to the memorial, but they came to the interview and wanted to talk educatedly about, seem educated about it. So I didn't want to be one of those people. So I came down on my own, and I had the same reaction I think everyone does. It snuck up on me in the middle of the city, and there it was, and I thought it was beautiful. The front of it is gorgeous. It was a bright, sunny spring April day. This was before Fiesta, so it wasn't quite at the peak season of tourism yet. I wandered through on my own, and I enjoyed every part of it. I enjoyed the history. I immediately connected with the story. I love the drama of the story, and the site itself, I saw plenty of potential for where different experiences could happen on site in terms of storytelling, and that's what I took into my interview with me. Just a lot of excitement and ready to go.
All right, one more.
I teach 7th grade, and I was at the memorial about a month ago, and I just want to thank you because it was absolutely stunning. Our 7th graders, whether you realize it in this room, were not born on 9/11. Right. They have no knowledge of it, and we taught it this year, and they thanked us because for many of them, they've never heard the story before.
Yeah.
And it's the same as the Alamo. They've never heard the full story, and they just think about that in this room. The 7th graders have no knowledge of 9/11.
Yeah, it was something that we knew was coming very early on in our education department in New York, and they tackled it with a lot of resources, and they still tackle it with a lot of resources. They bring on educator teams to conduct school tours. Their school outreach across the country is very, very impressive. It's the point that you make about it being a story that can be so easily forgotten is something that our CEO said we will not let happen, and we were all, as department heads, given the directive to figure out ways to make sure that doesn't happen. All right, thank you very much.